evening, and thank you for returning. This evening, we will explore the lanes of Pompeii in the time before the heavens grew dim, constituted a typical day in a community that dwelled securely beneath a tranquil mountain. In what manner did individuals labor, dine, procure goods, venerate their gods, and seek repose when existence felt stable and certain? Envision the morning light on sun-warmed cobblestones. Millers activate the grinders, bakers fashion hoops of bread. Vapor ascends from the communal baths, where acquaintances exchange the latest happenings. At street-side counters, thermopolia, earthenware vessels maintain the warmth of wine and stew, available for any passerby. Within sophisticated residences, gardens gleam with reflective pools and vibrant murals, as modest household altars radiate with the light of oil lamps, honoring the domestic spirits, becomes animated with chatter. Vendors determine the weight of their products. Fish sauce, secured in pottery, awaits clientele. Textile artisans pound garments clean at the Phalonica. Water flows from fountains supplied by concealed aqueducts, and leaden pipes hum with its constant passage, pursue one another over intricate mosaics. The melody of a flute drifts from a courtyard lesson. At the city's periphery, the amphitheater waits, its benches absorbing the solar warmth, while vineyards and fruit groves extend toward the coastline. Upon these walls, hastily written messages of affection, jests, and political endorsements reveal the concerns of the populace. In these chambers, bread left in ovens, valuables secured in chests, common implements set aside for the next day serve as reminders that no one foresaw the imminent future. As is customary, I am eager to learn from which part of the globe you are tuning in, and what the time is where you are. Whether you have come to relax, or to ease into sleep, delighted you are with me. Let us now commence. We start on a low terrace of earth that formerly met the sea. In ancient times, the coast of the Bay of Naples extended significantly more inland than it does presently, and the Sarno River's estuary formed a wide opening, a spit of land situated between the river and a dark formation of primeval lava. A populace speaking an Italic dialect, which academics term Oscan, trucked huts, cultivated the land, and observed the peak that subsequent generations would call Vesuvius. The ground beneath their feet was a legacy of profound geologic time, and cinders from previous eruptions had transformed into a fertile loam that accepted seeds eagerly and yielded abundant harvests of cereals, legumes, olives. The Sarno offered fresh water, an access route to the ocean, and a silted bank capable of sheltering a harbor. The initial sentences of Pompeii's history were dictated by its geography. The archaeological record provides these initial settlers with a tangible voice. Upon the plateau and down the inclines toward the eventual urban core, excavators have discovered indications of post holes, basic hearths, handcrafted ceramics, subsequently, wheel-thrown pottery, which signify a gradual evolution from dispersed homesteads to a centralized settlement. Rituals of burial and language position these pioneers within the larger Osco, Umbrian sphere of South, Central Italy. Their individual names, found on walls in Oscan lettering, pertain to that branch of Italic language. Initially, the settlement was diminutive, and its residences were unassuming. Even humble people select defensible terrain. The first line of defense capitalized on the existing topography. Masons erected segments of wall along the peak of an ancient lava deposit. They did not identify the rock that fractured under their tools. They possessed no concept of geology. They merely understood that elevated ground is more readily defended, and that stone hewn from solidified lava creates lasting masonry. On the other side of the bay, Hellenic mariners had previously established colonies along the Tyrrhenian. One of the first, on the island now known as Ischia, identified in Greek as Pithecusae. On the continental landmass, the formidable city of Cumae emerged on a tufa promontory overlooking the bay. These Greeks introduced literacy, standardized weights and measures, currency, a preference for decorated pottery that attracted keen purchasers across Campania. Remnants of Greek drinking vessels and mixing bowls are found among the initial imports in the Pompeian vicinity. They narrate a history of interaction and desire. Agriculturalist entering a marketplace with a container of grapes could depart with a glazed vessel from Corinth or Athens. Such straightforward transactions new customs in dining ware, new terms in the regional dialect, and new divinities in the local shrines proliferate. Spiritual life provides one of the most lucid indicators of this early interaction. The prominence above the eventual triangular forum retains the foundation of a 6th century temple built in the archaic Doric style. Nearby, adjacent to the later civic forum, a sanctuary dedicated to Apollo materialized, featuring columned porticos and an altar that would persist into the Roman period. Inscriptions and statuary indicate a cult that is Hellenic in its visual representation and ritual character, yet rendered local by the artisans who sculpted it and the officials who financed it. To an Oscan farmer, Apollo is not an alien deity. He is a potent neighbor who receives oblations at planting time and again at the harvest, who safeguards the port, who confers status upon the families that fund his celebrations. The urban layout materializing during this era is a layered record of pragmatic decisions and assimilated concepts. Thoroughfares still adhere to the contours of the ridge and the riverbank rather than any rigid grid. Dwellings face inward toward sheltered courtyards that capture sunlight and wind. A Mediterranean solution to warmth and grit are situated along the lanes. The existence of a port on the Sarno is more than a mere convenience. It is the driver of expansion. Arrive laden with wine and oil from other Campanian properties and from more distant locations. New ceramic styles arrive with them, as do concepts of fashion that patrons request local artisans to replicate. What contemporary society terms globalization is already functioning along the bay. To mention affluence is not to imply universal luxury. The majority of individuals still procured their sustenance by cultivating grapes and trees on modest parcels outside the fortifications, guiding swine through oak forests for forage, and transporting baskets of goods to the marketplace. Nonetheless, affluence tends to bequeath civic imprints. In the later archaic era, the populace invests in more robust walls, strong gates, and public areas that start to approximate a forum, can be gauged by stonework. Expenditures on enduring structures, utilizing dressed blocks and formal colonnades, indicate that the inhabitants trusted in their city's future. It also signifies they possessed assets worth safeguarding. Pompeii's neighbors were not exclusively Greek. To the north, Etruscan influence extended into Campania. Throughout the 7th and 6th centuries, Etruscan vendors and craftspeople left their mark in burial customs and bronze craftsmanship. For a period, Etruscan aristocracies wielded influence over cities in the plain. Pompeians existed at an intersection of cultures and developed skills to navigate among them, occasionally yielding, frequently trading, consistently adopting what was beneficial. The outcome, by the 5th century, is a community that appears simultaneously indigenous and worldly. It converses in Oscan in the lanes, utters Greek in its holy places, and negotiates with Etruscan merchants over bronze and textiles. Farming sustains the entire enterprise. The grapevines on the mountain's lower inclines and along the Sarno were already renowned in Roman times for their potency and taste. There is no basis to question that the initial Oscan farmers comprehended the blend of volcanic earth, sea air, meticulous pruning that allows a vineyard to flourish. Olive trees required more time to reach maturity, but once established, the pressing facilities could operate through the autumn, dispatching jars downriver to the port, and subsequently along the coast. The river itself was an instructor. Each inundation deposited fresh silt on the lowlands, and with every cycle, the farmers discerned where to construct a levee or excavate a channel. The city learned the identical lesson on a larger scale, positioned its ramparts on high terrain, spanned the marshy areas with stone, and permitted the river to bear the expense of enriching the fields. Daily existence in this nascent phase was neither crude nor disconnected. Implements of iron improved plowshares and shears. Weights attest to domestic textile manufacturing. Small terracotta figures of deities and creatures imply both devotion and amusement. The assortment of pigments applied to temples and homes started to intensify under Hellenic influence. Even culinary practices shifted. Imported vessels designed for Greek dishes shared space with indigenous forms. In such minutiae, perceive a community that maintained its balance, while the world beyond the bay was in motion. By the latter part of the 5th century, The settlement destined to become Pompeii was an established feature on the Campanian map. It possessed a recognized urban center, sanctuaries with sponsors and schedules, a fortified perimeter, and the genesis of a port-based economy. Inhabitants recognized that their prosperity was linked to broader movements. They had absorbed lessons from Greeks and negotiated with Etruscans, had observed foreigners arriving by sea, and had dispatched their own sons as mariners and merchants. They did not yet foresee Roman officials governing in their forum, nor military veterans residing on their streets, nor the mountain above them awakening with destructive force. They understood only that the soil was productive, the river was beneficial, the world beyond the bay could be both bountiful and challenging. If a singular truth resides in these origins, it is that Pompeii did not emerge fully realized from Roman design. It developed from the decisions of Oscan agriculturalists and artisans who capitalized on a favorable location and seized every opportunity for interaction with powers exceeding their own. They acted with a perceptive understanding of the terrain, a respect for the deities, who seemed to favor their hill, an openness to adopt the implements and preferences that commerce presented to them. In that regard, Pompeii was already intrinsically Roman well before Rome's arrival. It was pragmatic, flexible, and firmly rooted in its location. The initial alteration in Pompeii's trajectory originated from the north. Across the Campanian plain, the Etruscans had established a network of influence that extended from their central territories into the productive lands surrounding the bay. They journeyed with artisans and traders, with bronze craftsmen and constructors who understood how to position massive blocks in systematic rows. Their footprint in Campania is evident in tombs and metal artifacts, and in the customs of civic existence that persist in a town long after military forces depart. Pompeii experienced that contact. You perceive it in imported items placed in graves, in the sporadic adoption of Etruscan designs, in the sheer reality that the town was now integrated into a larger narrative along the Tyrrhenian coast. Etruscans were not the sole sea-oriented power in the vicinity. To the west lay Greek territory, and beyond it a sequence of Greek settlements that encircled the southern coasts of Italy. For many years, these two cultures appraised one another through commerce and conflict. The decisive moment occurred in the early 5th century, when the tyrant of Syracuse, Hiero, north to support Cumae, in a fiercely contested engagement off the coast in the year later historians designated as 474 before the Common Era. Etruscan navy sustained a defeat. The result did not obliterate Etruscan culture in Campania, but it did weaken the constraints of Etruscan dominance and create an opening for new participants. In the vales and highlands east of the plain resided the Samnites, upland peoples who spoke Oscan, just as Pompeii's original settlers did, who regarded the fertile soils of Campania with a shepherd's astute observation. The Samnites were mountain dwellers who migrated with the changing seasons. Their livestock followed an extended cycle of grazing, descending to the plains as the grasses matured, and withdrawing to elevated meadows during the heat. Migrations cultivate resilient men and adept small unit combatants, also nurture networks of kinship that can rapidly grow into leagues and alliances when an opening presents itself. In the latter 5th century, such an opening materialized. The erosion of Etruscan hegemony allowed Samnite factions to gain a foothold in the plain, initially as laborers and garrison forces, subsequently as governors in their own right. Eventually, the very term Campani would designate communities whose ruling class originated from Samnite ancestry, but coexisted with Greek and Etruscan neighbors, adopting Greek adornments and speaking Oscan in public forums. Pompeii was positioned on a ridge of ancient lava, with a navigable river nearby. Any group aiming to control the plain would covet a station there to monitor the Sarno estuary and the access to the bay. The Samnites captured the town, they did not relinquish it. On the contrary, they proceeded to transform it into their preferred kind of location, were reinforced along the natural elevation. By the 4th century, the perimeter that visitors trace presently had assumed a discernible outline, a defensive boundary of approximately 3 kilometers, featuring robust towers and a series of gates that provided access toward Herculaneum, Stabaya, New Syria, the coast. Stone was extracted from adjacent tufa deposits and from the Sarno limestone. Masonry blocks arranged in orderly courses demonstrate a community ready to allocate resources for durability. In Campania, assesses confidence by the robustness of the wall. Religion was adjusted rather than eliminated. The elder sanctuary dedicated to Apollo maintained its prestige. The city also established cult sites that reflected the preferences of the new leadership and the widespread Hellenic style that had, by this time, permeated the region. On the high promontory that would eventually be known as the Triangular Forum, archaic Doric temple surveyed the river mouth toward the bay. Beyond the fortifications, sanctuaries collected votives from mariners and farmers equally. The marshy depression known presently as Fondo Iwazino has produced collections of armaments and inscribed vessels, suggesting an active fusion of Greek and Oscan devotion. The votives indicate that men who journeyed by sea and men who tilled the soil offered pledges at that water's edge. It was a location where a community communicated with its gods regarding security and prosperity in a volatile world. The configuration of the town inside the walls likewise transformed. The Samnite era in Pompeii aligns with what archaeologists term a Hellenistic urban phase. Expression denotes a fusion of Italic heritage and Greek urban design that Campanian elites adopted. Streets were straightened where feasible. Public squares acquired porticos. Civic structures incorporated colonnades, fashioning shaded walkways for commerce and political discourse. The expansive area that would evolve into the Forum, magistrates set up a tribunal from which they could preside officially and adjudicate disagreements. The initial iteration of the basilica and the subsequent law courts date to a later period. The practice of utilizing a central rectangle as the nucleus of civic activity is already apparent. The residences of Pompeii document this transformation even more distinctly. On lanes ascending from the river to the ridge, domestic design converged on the Italic courtyard, layout known to researchers as the atrium house. The earliest versions are humble. Guest would pass through a vestibule into a central chamber. Exposed to the elements, precipitation entered through a rectangular aperture and accumulated in a shallow cistern. Light and air concentrated there. Chambers were arrayed around it. By the 3rd century, more imposing examples are identifiable. The house of the surgeon, meticulous stonework, and proportioned rooms, dates to this era and signifies that patrons in Samnite Pompeii were hiring builders to provide them with both comfort and social standing. Subsequent masterworks, the House of the Faun, would elevate the standard further with Greek-inspired peristyles and opulent mosaics. Their origins are in a Samnite city that had learned to inhabit its space generously. Commerce advanced concurrently. Campania was the agricultural heart of Italy, and Samnite Pompeii was situated near the estuary of a passable river. Amphorae for wine and oil are abundant in the archaeological findings of the area. Black gloss ceramics from Greek ateliers appear in large amounts, only to be replicated by local kilns that mastered the glossy finish. Fashion accessories mimic Etruscan designs and subsequently develop Campanian idiosyncrasies. The market district south of the Forum became dense with shops whose counters opened straight onto the thoroughfare. In such ateliers, stones were dressed, sandals were sewn, and jars of olives were brined and vended. A town that reinforces its defenses and enhances its dwellings is a town sufficiently assured to grant credit and to anticipate the following year's harvest with more than mere optimism. The Samnites did not reside in a tranquil enclave. Their dominance in the plain brought them into opposition with other Campanian elites and, subsequently, an emerging power ascending from the Latin hills. Rome in the 4th century had surpassed the small agrarian city of its legends and had begun to cast its gaze southward. The First Samnite War commenced over jurisdiction of a neighboring upland city. Although the initial hostilities concluded without significant alteration, it established the template for the ensuing conflicts. The Latin War, which dissolved the autonomy of Rome's long-standing Latin confederates, consolidated Roman organization. The Second Samnite War demonstrated how formidable highland combatants could be against legions navigating constricted terrain. In that conflict, Roman authors chronicled a disgrace in a mountain defile, where the Romans were compelled to surrender their weapons and pass beneath a yoke. Conflict possessed its own harsh calculus. Yet conflicts conclude. They frequently conclude favoring the side that can deploy men to the field consistently, construct roads to provision them, replenish casualties with fresh manpower. Ultimately, Rome comprehended the terrain, modified its strategies, and exhausted its adversary. Throughout these decades, Pompeii occupied a passage between the mountains and the sea. The town furnished grain, oil, wine, and manpower. It observed military columns on the coastal route and received reports of triumphs and setbacks conveyed to the forum by muleteers and mariners. The alliance structures in Campania fluctuated like tides. Capua, the prominent city of the plain, directed the allegiances of subordinate towns. Those allegiances were scrutinized every time a new conscription occurred or a new pact was formalized. Pompeii did during these years was what pragmatic towns invariably do. It strengthened its defenses. It invested in sacred sites that could accommodate all factions. It cultivated patrons among the influential. It maintained its river and its port, because a town with functional access keys can provision garrisons and gain from the circulation of armies. Archaeology permits us to perceive what lies beyond the political boundaries. Street-facing walls in the Samnite strata are marked by narrow entrances that lead into deep shops. Many of these shops is a courtyard featuring a cistern and a modest shrine. Graffiti and Oscan lettering adhere to these levels, incised into plaster, before Latin public announcements supplanted them. Tombs beyond the walls are situated along the routes approaching the gates, a reminder that in Italic tradition, the deceased delineate the approaches to the living city. The necropolis along the road to Herculaneum starts to assume its recognized configuration as family units demarcate territory, with low fences and stela. Memorials are not grandiose, but they demonstrate pride and persistence. Names reappear over generations. A town whose deceased are meticulously honored is a town that asserts it belongs where it is situated. It is alluring to envision Samnite Pompeii as a provincial outpost, eclipsed by the brilliance of Greek Naples and the vast properties of Capua. The material evidence conveys a different narrative. This was a populace that assimilated influences from every direction and manipulated them to its benefit, acquired the Greek method of positioning a colonnade and the Etruscan method of sculpting a lintel, maintained its Oscan dialect in the courts and on the walls, and donned Greek adornments at celebrations. It consumed wine at tables set with black gloss vessels, and served that wine from containers produced in local kilns. It observed foreign troops passing and weighed its public statements, as towns do when empires exert pressure. The time Rome appears in the documented history of Pompeii, in the early 3rd century. The city's underpinnings are already established. The walls are positioned on their lava promontory. The gates provide access to roads connecting the town to its neighbors. The sanctuaries observe their festivals. The forum is the accepted location for commerce and official statements. Residential designs exhibit a confidence that can permit measured elegance. Was yet to arrive were the strains of broader imperial dynamics and the comprehensive reorganization that would ensue after a catastrophic uprising. Destiny pertains to a subsequent chapter. For the time being, in the final century before Pompeii's initial notation by Roman authors, the town is a Samnite city of Campania, sufficiently stable to invest in stone, sufficiently pious to fill its altars, sufficiently astute to trade with any party arriving up the Sarno with merchandise and currency. Rome gazed southward across the Campanian plain in the 3rd century. Before the Common Era, it encountered a terrain already abundant with cities, farms. On the lava terrace above the Sarno estuary, Pompeii existed among these communities as a fortified Samnite town, retaining Greek preferences, dialect, and Etruscan customs still apparent in its stonework and rituals. Rome's protracted conflict with the Samnites pulled the Campanian towns, they desired it or not, into the sphere of a republic that was mastering the art of managing allies, just as meticulously as it directed legions. The accord that resulted was a product of Roman brilliance. Municipalities such as Pompeii would persist as communities, possessing their own councils, festivals, regional statutes. In exchange they would become soci of Rome, obligated to furnish soldiers provisions and allegiance. Citizenship was deferred, taxation was determined via treaties. Status would be derived from the city on the Tiber, and compensated with grain, men, and compliance. Archaeology enables us to observe the tangible consequences of this federation. Roads, the silent framework of dominance. Pompeii, more firmly to the Campanian grid. The established coastal and riverine routes expand with milestones and depots linked to the major Roman highways that extended to Capua and further. Porters transport pottery bearing makers' insignias traceable to remote kilns. Black gloss dining ware from Campanian workshops becomes prevalent in Pompeian homes, succeeded by new Italic designs that replicate and modify Greek precedents. The town's monetary practices mirror the currency revolution Rome propelled across the Western Mediterranean. Silver currency penetrates local commerce in greater volumes, bringing with it a detailed cash-based economy that enhances market efficiency, rents more predictable, and simplifies tax collection. The Forum Plaza, still an asymmetrical rectangle reflecting the older land contours, starts to operate as a Roman-style civic arena. Magistrates who previously issued edicts in Oscan now occupied public space with functionaries familiar with Latin procedures and Roman calendar dates. Bilingual texts endure from this era, a testament that legal transformation on the imperial frontier frequently manifests as a conversation rather than an edict. Some building fronts receive new facades with measured designs that foreshadow the grand projects of a succeeding century. Remains Samnite in its laws and in the names inscribed on its walls, but its civic conduct increasingly adheres to Roman precedents. To the west, the expansion of Puteoli revolutionizes Campanian commerce. That port, favored by the winds and by Roman strategy, emerges as the primary hub for Italian trade with the Hellenic world and with Egypt. The vessels that frequent Puteoli do not overlook smaller destinations. The Sarno estuary is a brief journey distant. Pompeii's wine and oil facilities could consequently transport their goods through a distribution network that expanded clientele and revenue. The amphorae for wine adopt contours that are identifiable across the sea, stamps and tituli picti. The painted identifiers on jar shoulders illustrate the proliferation of Campanian labels and the ascent of merchant families who converted agricultural assets into political influence. The Second Punic War casts a shadow over this affluence. When Hannibal traverses the Alps and brings devastation to Italy, the prominent Campanian city of Capua defects to the Carthaginian cause, subsequently paying for it with Roman retribution, experiences incursions and alerts. Nearby Nuceria endures severe hardship. Position on the Sarno and its status as an allied town render it a supplier and an observer. Garrisons relocate. Grain requisitions are implemented. The vineyards mature under a sky that might, at any moment, reveal unfamiliar vessels. The evidence from Pompeii during these years is characterized less by the trauma of invasion than by the reinforcement of stone. Walls are preserved, and towers display upkeep. In turbulent times, cities invest in their perimeter and in storage facilities. 2nd century introduces a new variant of Campanian prosperity, less striking but more widespread. Refined farms proliferate in the hinterland, equipped with presses, storage vessels, and the personnel to operate them. Villas, both suburban and bucolic, start to explore a vocabulary of opulence that will define the magnificence of the 1st century. Mosaic floors of modest black and white manifest in dwellings that, 2 generations prior, would have been satisfied with compressed earth and painted plaster. Atrium house develops subtly. A rear garden court with colonnades, the peristyle, is incorporated into certain properties, represents a Greek structure adapted to an Italic context. In Pompeii, the adaptation is remarkably seamless. If the material evidence suggests order, political evidence reveals tensions. Throughout Italy, the Allies resisted the constraints of their arrangement with Rome. Their young men served in Roman armies, sacrificed in Roman conflicts, went back to towns that were excluded from the citizenship that provided access to Roman tribunals and Roman influence. Discontent consolidated into a campaign whose expression became straightforward and compelling. If we sustain the Republic's burdens, partake in its privileges. The narrative of that insistence is the social war, and Pompeii assumes a prominent role. The inciting incidents are recognizable. A proposition to broaden citizenship significantly is thwarted in Rome by a combination of obstructionism and anxiety. Influential Italian figure is assassinated. The Allies resort to arms. In the year 90, one before the Common Era, the rebellious coalition establishes a capital at Corfinium in the Abruzzi, renaming it Italia. They produce currency proclaiming an Italian nation. The map of central and southern Italy, which had appeared stable for a generation, splinters along historic seams. Town after town is forced to choose. Pompeii, Oscan heritage, had never fully faded, and whose commercial center understood how much Campania had contributed to Rome, aligns with the insurrection. Choice brings conflict to its gates. The social war is a struggle of blockades, skirmishes, and arduous marches. Roman commanders, to become widely recognized, establish their renown here. The most notable among them for Campania is Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a nobleman possessing a talent for velocity and methodical ruthlessness. In 89, he materializes before Pompeii with disciplined troops and contemporary siege equipment. Excavations have unearthed caches of spherical stone projectiles, the ordnance of catapults that once arched over the ramparts, shattering roofs and morale within the town. The lava ridge that had rendered the initial defenses so effective now benefits Rome, dictates the parameters of the assault and the trajectories for artillery. Siege mounds and tunnels undermine the suburbs. The garrison resists, the markets clear. Those who are able head to the countryside with children and valuables to stay with relatives. Gains insight into the siege, not only from the blemishes in the stonework, but also from the administrative records that conflict invariably produces. Statutes enacted in Rome during these years extended citizenship to allies who stayed loyal, subsequently to insurgents who would disarm and enroll with an official within a specified time frame. The Lex Julia of 90 offers the initial broad concession. The Lex Plautius Papiria of 89 extends it. Strategy and artillery advance in tandem. For many settlements, this suffices. For Pompeii, it does not, at least not immediately. The city resists long enough to experience the severity of Sulla's pressure. The price is evident in the archaeological findings. Subsequent repairs repurpose miscellaneous blocks and sculptural debris, clear indication that once, refined structures were demolished and then hastily mended. The exterior surfaces of some towers display Roman tooling not present in the original Samnite construction. Streets in the northeastern quadrant retain evidence of scorched material inconsistent with the later devastation of the eruption. There is also the quiet that ensues after a suppressed uprising. The Oscan inscriptions grow less common. The names appearing on property boundaries, on weights, start to trend Roman. Despite this, the shift does not occur instantaneously. Conflict does not terminate a city's existence. Bakers restart ovens because sustenance is necessary. Merchants resume transporting wine because grapevines continue to bear fruit while men dispute. Around the forum, makeshift stands offer whatever the surrounding lands can provide. The river transports barges because the waterway persists. Someone will invariably engage a vessel to transport olive oil and tiles. There is a human resilience in this phase that a history focused on generals might overlook. Families organize unions that will restore wealth on both sides of a disagreement, maintain schedules and perform ceremonies because harvests and pledges are indifferent to political alignments. Builders complete road surfacing initiated before the first projectiles fell from Sulla's machines, because a well-maintained pavement protects a mule's joints and preserves a wagon's integrity. In the final phase of the social war, the Roman proposal of citizenship transitions from pledge to policy. Italians acquire the privileges and responsibilities of Roman citizens, initially in a restricted manner, that retained many voting advantages for Rome's established tribes in more inclusive forms as the old political framework adapted to the new populace. For Pompeii, signifies inclusion within the legal structure of the republic. Magistrates will henceforth conduct affairs using Latin procedures, will be required to honor Roman agreements and Roman inheritance statutes. The tax rolls will mirror Roman classifications. The town will soon forfeit is a degree of self-governance. What it will acquire are the protections and the obligations associated with being Roman. The decade concludes with the city battered and reflective, yet not shattered. The walls remain on their lava prominence. The Forum continues to attract merchants from the Sarno and supplicants from the farms. Residences continue to develop in a manner that suggests luxury for those with the means to acquire it. The countryside, with its renowned soil, tranquility to demonstrate its potential in a stable market. Above all, the city awaits the man who blockaded it to finalize his rise, will shortly control Roman politics. When he does, he will come back to Campania, not as a commander before defiant walls, but as the arbiter of the Republic, with statutes to place veterans and stipends to allocate to supporters. That is the next development in the narrative, and in Pompeii will alter street layouts, voter registries, and even the inscriptions on the stones. When the social war concluded, held not just a military success, but also a strategy. The Republic understood how to convert victory into organization. Expropriation, colonization, a comprehensive revision existence were methods as recognizable to Roman leadership as the legions. Nowhere in Campania would these methods penetrate more precisely than at Pompeii. In the year ensuing the insurgents' defeat, Cornelius Sulla returns to the bay, not as a besieger beyond the ramparts, but as the director of Roman policy. He brings with him the authority to expropriate and to colonize, a belief that order is a substance one can decant into a city's streets like fluid concrete and allow it to harden. The legal maneuver is concise and absolute, is reorganized as a colony of Roman citizens, bearing a designation that integrates politics, ancestral pride, and devotion into a single identifier, Colonia Cornelia Veneria Pompinorum. Cornelia denotes the gens of Sulla. Veneria appeals to the patron goddess Sulla champion. The final term secures the new statute in the ancient terrain. In effect, this signifies that a panel of commissioners assesses the town and its environs, drafts a constitution, and allocates urban residences and agricultural parcels to colonists drawn from Sulla's veterans and backers. The specialized Latin of the constitution establishes a municipal framework common to every Roman town from Spain to the Adriatic. There will be a body of regional senators known as decurions who convene in council at the basilica. There will be two primary officials, the duoveri, tribunals and public affairs. Two aediles will oversee markets, thoroughfares, and public decorum. Elections will occur annually. Finances will be displayed in the forum. Ceremonies will adhere to the Roman calendar. Critically, the language of jurisprudence will be Latin. Can observe this transformation in the testimony of the stones. Oscan inscriptions, which previously populated the walls of Pompeii, start to diminish into earlier strata. Bilingual text persists sporadically, a signal that the city's heritage does not disappear instantly. The new public articulation is Roman. Names convey the identical narrative. A property boundary in the Samnite era might have displayed an Oscan gentilicium. The new markers introduce colonist families with Latin praenomina and nomina gentilicia. The very orthography of names transforms into a small diagram of power. Previously registered with Oscan letters, now campaign for office using Latin designations. The rationale is straightforward and unyielding. You wish to lead in a Roman colony, you must acquire the ability to be perceived and understood as a Roman. Colonization is invariably more than documentation. Veterans arrive with their households and their customs. They introduce a preference for particular diversions and a conviction that public splendor is the marker of personal achievement. They also bring dependents and business connections from the military camps and campaign routes. At Pompeii, new inhabitants do not just appropriate existing dwellings, they reconfigure the town. Property is assessed, partitioned, and, in certain instances, reallocated. Former owners who resisted Rome forfeit assets within the walls and in the surrounding lands. Permitted to stay frequently alter their political alignment swiftly. Marital unions between colonists and established families proliferate. A single generation. The electoral notices on street corners reflect the new hierarchy, with painted solicitations for men with Roman names, ported by wealth derived from farms, ateliers, and financing. Public projects are the most discernible aspect of this reorganization. The forum is streamlined with porticos and uniform facades that provide a suitable setting for the new officials. The basilica, already an imposing edifice from the late 2nd century, mended and recommissioned as the tribunal and commercial center of a colony that has new disputes to resolve and new agreements to formalize. Paving blocks advance across thoroughfares that once undulated with compressed earth. Curb heights are standardized so that a cartwheel no longer fractures a spoke between corners. Stepping stones are positioned at intervals, enabling a citizen in white attire to traverse a bustling lane without soiling his hem. Even the drainage channels attest to a renewed focus on order. They are carved straighter and deeper, and the silt collectors at the intersections are more meticulously constructed. The symbol of the sullen reorganization, however, is situated not in the forum, but at the town's periphery, where the lava promontory descends toward the river. In 70 before the Common Era, two men whose names feature prominently in early colony affairs, Gaius Quinctius Valgus and Marcus Porcius, financed a structure that Rome had come to adore and that Pompeii would embrace as its own. It is the amphitheater. It ranks among the earliest enduring stone arenas in the Roman world. The dedicatory text clarifies that these patrons were duoviri, who presented a contribution to the colonists and the indigenous populace. The design is audacious and functional. Rather than excavating a basin into a slope, as the Greeks did for their theaters, the constructors here encircled an oval of terrain with a wall and banks of compacted earth, then unified the edifice with ramps, arches, masonry frameworks supporting tiers of benches. The arena surface is set low, allowing attendees to look down upon the sand where combatants and hunters performed. Capacity projections cluster around 20,000 individuals, figure vastly surpassing the town's resident populace, indicating that the amphitheater served as a regional attraction. Rural inhabitants and citizens from adjacent cities would stream through the entrances for the celebrations, would proliferate across the adjacent field with inexpensive wine, roasted legumes, and keepsakes. On festival days, a colony's economy proliferates. The amphitheater accomplished tasks that were societal as well as entertaining. Gladiatorial contests were more than brutal diversion. They were mechanisms of civic assimilation. Colonists and locals could sit together under a brilliant Campanian sky, while a benefactor funded the event, and had his name proclaimed by an announcer before the initial trumpet blast. A city that has been captured and reorganized requires ceremonies in which victors and vanquished can discover a unified voice. Sustenance is vital, spectacle is crucial. As the years elapsed, the walls of Pompeii would accumulate impassioned graffiti praising star combatants and disparaging rival towns. One day, those emotions would escalate into a disturbance that resulted in a censure from the emperor. For the present, the new arena fulfills its unifying purpose. Who battled on opposing sides in the social war now applaud the same Ricciarius and condemn the same official. The colony also finances a secondary performance venue of a distinct character. A compact, covered theater, the Odeon, constructed near the larger open-air theater on the town's south side. Condensed layout and sheltered seating fashion an intimate auditorium suitable for oratory, musical showcases, civic functions when sun or rain rendered the open cava less accommodating. Here, the spoken word becomes the main event. The voices of poets and regional orators could reach the rear seats without difficulty. The patronage principle mirrors that of the amphitheater. A contributor finances the construction, the city convenes, and the contributor's name is etched into stone and embedded in the public consciousness. Religion adapts to the new political landscape with Roman fluidity. The colony's formal name declares its allegiance to Venus, goddess Sulla had adopted as his patron during his ascent to dominance. In Pompeii, that allegiance manifests in brick and mortar near the Porta Marina, where a temple to Venus surveys the sea from the lower terraces. The cult is not unfamiliar to Campania, where Greek Aphrodite had long been venerated. Its new elevated status connects a local sanctuary to the lineage of the governing family in Rome. Processions ascend the slope on designated days. Magistrates present sacrifices at the altar. Mariners offer pledges seeking safe passage at the river's mouth. One wishes to observe how religion and politics integrate a colony. One can witness a festival day as the duovari proceed in white vestments before the populace, pouring libations upon the steps of the goddess, who has favored their city and their professions. Domestic design reflects the colony's hunger for prestige. The atrium house persists as the foundational layout, but its proportions expand, and its detailing improves along streets where colonists establish residences. Entrances are broadened to signal prominence. Vestibules are elongated into corridors that strategically reveal the central hall. Floors in the main chambers are refinished with mosaics of black and white tesserae. A dignified and costly trend received new plaster, and a subsequent generation of painted embellishment that starts to explore illusionistic borders and suspended panels. Courtyards at the rear evolve into formal peristyles. Colonnades designed to capture the breeze and direct the gaze toward fountains and meticulously cultivated greenery. Decisions are not simple self-indulgence. They are expenditures in political currency. Voters inspect houses. Dependents queue in the mornings beneath these colonnades to salute their patrons and to accept the modest tokens that maintain allegiance. Private setting of a dwelling is wielded as a public tool. Commerce advances with this architectural momentum. The colony possesses more inhabitants and more currency. Workshops proliferate along the main routes leading from the forum to the gates. Bakers expand their enterprises with stepped mills, powered by donkeys and rows of ovens capable of managing daily output for an entire district. Metalworkers mend agricultural implements and fabricate hardware for doors and trunks. Fullers establish facilities where tunics and cloaks are cleansed with water and the acrid ammonia supplied by the city's public urine collectors. Wine merchants dispatch more amphorae, bearing insignias that will stay discernible for archaeologists to interpret. The countryside experiences these shifts as properties adapt to a broader and more stable market. Pressing facilities in the villas operate longer hours during the harvest. Storage chambers fill with the substantial forms of clay vessels. We could position ourselves on a ridge above the river. On a clear morning in the colony's first generation, we would observe a procession of mules carefully navigating a path toward the port, while a small squadron of river vessels bobbed at their moorings to transport the town's assets to larger vessels at Puteoli. Politics in a nascent colony possesses a distinct character. A flurry of activity occurs as allegiances are forged and reformed. Aspiring leaders cultivate relationships with both colonists and established families. Painted electoral appeals materialize on stuccoed walls in a style that is simultaneously conventional and insightful. Supporters exhort passers-by to elect a candidate who is trustworthy, benevolent, and a reliable provider of sustenance. Occasionally, professional guild advocates collectively. Sometimes, a cluster of neighbors or even a tavern announces a favorite. The duovari who financed the amphitheater revisit the polls in subsequent years as patrons and mediators. Established companion names do not disappear from these appeals, indicating that the colony did not discard the local aristocracy. Instead, the new framework draws ambitious individuals from both factions into a contest governed by Roman regulations and Campanian fervor. Tension is inherent in any coercive reorganization. The legal pretense of a fresh start never fully obscures the trauma of expropriation. Graffiti from subsequent decades contain taunts that recall who was an outsider and who was previously an adversary. Yet, the colony's everyday existence its own solidarity. The children of colonists and locals study Latin in the same academies and attend the same festivals, unite artisans in practices that overlook past loyalties and value proficiency. So the civic cults officiate at ceremonies that pledge prosperity for all who attend. Markets, marriages, municipal festivals accomplish the gradual work that policy can only initiate. By the conclusion of the 1st century, before the Common Era has succeeded, Pompeii regards itself as a Roman city. Its calendar is Roman. Its officials are Roman. Temple to Venus connects it to a Roman narrative of triumph and divine favor. The old Oscan dialect might still be discerned in jests in the taverns and in the lore of grandmothers. But the vernacular of aspiration is Latin. Physical city confirms this. From the forum to the gates, and from the amphitheater to the river, the colony's stones exhibit a confidence that anticipates the next generation will build taller paint more vividly, and celebrate more exuberantly. The broader world will soon validate this confidence with an extended period of tranquility under new leadership. The wealth and style that emanate from an empire at peace will adorn Pompeii in a fashion even more splendid than the colony's originators envisioned. For the present, suffices to stand in the amphitheater on a luminous afternoon and absorb the clamor of a city that has learned to express its approval collectively. The veterans who secured the privilege to reside here have endowed Pompeii with new structures and new landmarks. The families who came before them have provided the rootedness that transforms a city from a mere location. Cooperatively, they have fashioned a Roman Pompeii whose voice will resonate clearly into the era of Augustus and beyond. The empire materialized not as a sudden proclamation, as a shift in the atmosphere. Following the turmoil and reorganization of the late Republic, Pompeii transitioned into the Augustan period with its frameworks established and its goals aligned with a larger arena. The lava promontory above the Sarno now supported a colony that conversed in Latin procedures, chose officials through annual ballots, maintained precise records on bronze plaques, and comprehended how to convert spectacle, commerce, and devotion into assets. The first emperor had no need to subjugate Pompeii. He merely had to provide the commodity that a commercial town prizes most. He provided stability. Stability in Campania was not a theoretical concept, it was quantifiable in stone and water. Under Augustus, the extensive aqueduct originating from the Serino Springs, which the Romans named the Aqua Augusta, extended its arches and conduits across the mountains, delivering fresh water to the bay. Pompeii connected to this vital channel at the city's northern perimeter. The Castellum Aquae remains there, a functional tower with its 3 calibrated apertures, a stone device that allocated the current to fountains, baths, and private residences. Valves and lead fistula convey the narrative downhill, from that structure to more than 40 public cisterns, and to the conduits that supplied opulent homes. Children could drink at intersections shaded by fig trees. Bath attendants could rely on a constant water supply to fill heated and cooled chambers. Bakers could cleanse their troughs, and millers could rinse stone floors at the conclusion of a gritty day. When an ancient town obtains pressurized plumbing, inhabitants gain a new perception of time. Labor becomes more consistent. Hygiene is simplified. The city operates smoothly. Operational hum concentrates in the forum. It had served as a marketplace and civic backdrop for generations. The Augustan era instructed Pompeii in the Roman principles of monumentality. On the northern perimeter, the Temple of Jupiter had already dominated the skyline. In its late Republican iteration, underwent enhancements that rendered its staircase and platform suitable for imperial functions. Along the extended flanks of the plaza, new colonnades standardized the periphery, ensuring that announcements and legal proceedings had a respectable setting. The basilica at the southwestern intersection functioned as a tribunal and financial center, its nave and lateral aisles accommodating both legal practitioners and financiers. Opposite the basilica stood a structure with a distinct purpose. The Masilum was a covered emporium where meat, fish, and the finest goods from the Sarno farms were vended under a durable roof. Central tholos provided shade over scales and counters. Ice was unavailable, but shaded surfaces and quick hands made freshness a benefit of timeliness. Patrons learned to shop in the morning. No edifice better articulates the fusion of civic pride, commercial strength, imperial doctrine than the Eumachia building on the forum's eastern side. It is an immense porticoed structure with an imposing marble facade and a text identifying a woman as its patron. Eumachia, daughter of Lucius, priestess of Venus, financed the edifice to honor Concordia Augusta and Pietas. She was not embellishing the city out of leisure. She and her kin were deeply involved with the fullers and dyers who laundered, stretched, and treated textiles for the Campanian market. The entrance to the structure features a relief depicting wool processing. Guilds convened here. Men finalized agreements beneath likenesses of the imperial family. A priestess and a profession communicated in the vernacular. Augustus taught the empire. Reverence for the gods and faithfulness to the imperial house are not impediments to business. They are the prerequisites for its success. A short distance away, another sanctuary encapsulated the new political devotion with Campanian familiarity, the modest Temple of Fortuna. Augusta held a position on the street extending from the Forum toward the theater zone. It was established by an esteemed citizen named Marcus Tullius, not the renowned orator of Rome, a local figure who understood precisely how to synchronize the city's traditional reverence with the emerging cult of imperial fortune. Courtyards stood statues extolling the virtues of the governing dynasty. In its rites, the Duovari and the Augustales, priests of the imperial cult, frequently selected from the ranks of prosperous freedmen, executed the ceremonies that connected Pompeii to Rome with wreaths and libations. The Augustan environment is also discernible in the city's entertainment district. The large open-air theater had been excavated into the southern incline during the late Republic, was updated with a more sophisticated stage structure, seating embellishments befitting patrons who desired their contributions to be prominent. The Odeon, a smaller, roofed theater nearby, offered an auditorium where voices could resonate without wind or sun interference. Families such as the Holconi financed upgrades that inscribed their names in stone along stairwells and railings. The amphitheater at the eastern periphery, Republican contribution, gained new vitality under the early empire. Festivals were more expensive to organize and occurred more frequently. Organizers imported animals and combatants from greater distances. The graffiti that Pompeians incised on plaster walls functioned like the sports chronicles of a town that had learned to amuse itself publicly. The Forum and theaters represented the city's public persona. The baths constituted its public core. The Stabian baths, among the most ancient in Italy, were upgraded with enhanced heating mechanisms and the conventional sequence that transformed Roman bathing into a form of social ritual. A patron could deposit his sandals at the entrance and proceed through a temperate chamber to a heated chamber, immerse in a cold basin before transitioning to the palestra to exercise or converse. The Forum baths, near the Civic Plaza, provided a more centrally located option. Subsequently, along the incline toward the sea, the suburban baths would open, featuring elegant sea-facing chambers whose walls incorporated the latest trends in painting. Pompeii illustrates what the Roman world accomplished in the practice of daily comfort. It standardized hygiene and dialogue. The domestic realm flourished concurrently. Wall painting techniques progressed as a clear timeline of preferences. What researchers designate the second style, its painted architectural elements and illusion of dimensionality, had already converted residences into visual spectacles in the final Republican decades. Augustus, a new preference emerged. The third style emphasized delicate panels, suspended on opulent monochrome backgrounds, shifting focus from imagined panoramas to framed images and refined linear decorations. Chambers became showrooms where small mythological vignettes were displayed like precious stones. This trend is best interpreted as an assertion of worldly sophistication. A man whose dining chamber was painted in the current fashion indicated his standing in an empire of refined taste. In subsequent years, Augustus's successors, a fourth style would appear, blending spatial illusion and ornamental creativity with vibrant assurance. For the moment, the third style dominated social gatherings. Affluence was not confined to the city proper. Surrounding Pompeii generated villas that merged agriculture with leisure. Farm supervisors pressed grapes in extensive chambers lined with dolia, the large earthenware vessels embedded to their rims in the floor. Oil presses operated when the olives were harvested. The containers were sealed with resin and marked with names and dates. The Sarno transported the goods to the ports, and from there to Puteoli and further. Amphorae narrate the history with a clarity few ancient enterprises can rival. Dressel classifications serve as the index of achievement. Pian wine was shipped in containers that a merchant in Gaul or Spain would immediately recognize. Labels painted on jar shoulders declared the maker, and sometimes the grade, with a pride that verged on arrogance. Sauce also enhanced the town's reputation abroad. A notable producer, Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, mosaics in his dwelling that depicted amphorae of his garum as a symbol of success. He shipped flavor in clay, and the empire acquired a fondness for it. Within the fortifications, labor was perpetual and apparent. Bakers established large-scale facilities with teams of donkeys, rotating millstones day and night, with rows of ovens whose scorched artists still attest to thousands of loaves produced and vended. Fullers operated their vats near the forum, and treating textiles with water, clay, and the sharp odor of ammonia from containers that gathered urine at street intersections. Thermopolia, service counters of the Roman world, populated busy streets with vessels situated in masonry bars. There, a laborer could acquire hot stew and wine before going back to a workshop that afforded little opportunity for a domestically prepared meal. Ironmongers mended plowshares and chisels, and fabricated hardware that gave doors and trunks their distinctive sound. One traverses the city's long central axis from the Porta Marina up to the Porta Vesuvio. The cadence of shops and dwellings implies a populace numbering between 10,000 to 12,000 inhabitants within the walls, significantly more arriving from the farms and adjacent towns on market days. Currency and financing propelled this apparatus. Evidence from a suburban villa along the Sarno, where a collection of records associated with the Sulpici was discovered, provides insight into mid-1st century lending practices that catered to the requirements of both shipping and land ownership. Agreements were drafted for loans collateralized by merchandise and by real estate, with interest rates reflecting hazard and season. Pompeii and its environs were not a simple trade economy concealed in stone. They were a monetary society integrated into a network of credit that extended to Puteoli, Naples, and Rome. A baker could finance a shopfront. A vintner could obtain a loan against the vintage still maturing on the slopes. Shipper could use cargo already loaded on a barge at the Sarno estuary as collateral. Politics in this environment remained profoundly local, yet consistently aware of Rome. The Ordo of Decurions convened in their council and administered with consideration for the benevolence of the emperor. And the provincial governor, Duovari, campaigned using painted announcements that covered the end walls of streets. The electorate was encouraged to select men who were trustworthy, unassuming, reliable providers of sustenance. The expression is exact. Aediles managed the grain provision and public decorum. They were anticipated to finance festivals and public works from their personal funds as a preliminary step to greater office. Freedmen advanced within this structure through prosperity and by affiliation with colleges such as the Augustales. These priests of the imperial cult managed festivals that converted political allegiance into public celebration. The social hierarchy was not illusory. It existed in the forum and in the districts as a framework that linked slaves who might eventually be liberated, freedmen who might eventually fund festivals, citizens whose sons would seek positions on the council. Religion permeated every stratum of this existence. The historic sanctuaries dedicated to Apollo and Jupiter underwent repairs and gained new prominence. The Temple of Venus above the western gate connected the city to its originator and to the sea. Domestic altars in atria venerated the layers and the genius of the paterfamilias with wreaths and offerings of wine and grain. The imperial cult integrated itself into this cadence, incorporating processions in which officials guided the populace through streets adorned with garlands. Incense emanated from altars and youths learned hymns identifying the emperor as the guarantor of prosperity. External cults coexisted comfortably in this spiritual landscape. The sanctuary of Isis near the theater district provided music and rituals that had journeyed from Egypt through the Hellenistic world to Campania. Merchants and mariners found its blend of esotericism and reassurance appealing. The existence of that temple before the mid-century tremor indicates that Pompeii was receptive to piety arriving by sea. Urban configuration mirrored utility. The boundary of a volatile republic, the city walls were no longer required as a perpetual line of defense. Towers evolved into locations for viewing gardens and enjoying breezes. Segments of the wall were assimilated with dwellings that abutted the ancient stones. Gates were reconstructed with superior masonry and with inclines that softened the transit of carts. Streets were paved more comprehensively. Stepping stones were positioned more frequently, enabling citizens in white to traverse when the gutters flowed after a summer storm. Even the city's signage became more sophisticated. Painted informational panels on building fronts identified bakeries, wine shops, and workshops. Emblems on facades and paving stones signaled luck, procreation, and defense with a direct humor that was universally understood. Culmination of all these elements is a depiction of a city that comprehended its era. Under Augustus and his immediate successors, Pompeii was not an insignificant town on the periphery of a renowned bay. It was an operational component in the imperial framework and an innovative community that utilized that framework to prosper. It drew water from a mountain, distributed it through bronze and lead to every district, and converted it into bread, baths, and fountains. It adopted styles from Rome, Alexandria, Athens and rendered them into painted chambers and theatrical events, adopted jurisprudence from the capital and implemented it in a council chamber where contracts were reviewed and decisions rendered, adopted piety from ancient Latin temples and new imperial cults, arranging both on a schedule that reinforced continuity. Inhabitants evolved into a populace that trusted that the next day's markets would commence punctually. There were instabilities beneath this tranquility. The mountain that nurtured the vineyards was not dormant. Politics in Rome would falter as emperors succeeded one another. Populaces could become turbulent when arrogance and wine converged on a festival day. But those narratives belong to the subsequent phase. Augustan Pompeii that we perceive most vividly is a city that secured its affluence by seeking order and implementing it. Seeks to comprehend why the world would subsequently lament its demise, must first recognize how completely it was part of the living empire surrounding it, and how enthusiastically it embraced that empire as its own. Is a fragile textile. It is constructed from assurance and habit, and it can unravel swiftly when ego or nature tugs at its fibers. In Pompeii, the initial tug originated not from the mountain, but from humans. In the year that subsequent chroniclers documented as the consulship of Nero and Piso, gladiatorial contests were proceeding energetically at the amphitheater on the town's eastern perimeter. Edifice was scarcely a generation in age, and already a focus of civic pride, a landmark where colonists and established companion families occupied the same sun-drenched seats and applauded as a unified city. On that particular day, attendees from Nuceria arrived to observe the events. They carried with them the typical rivalry that accompanies a town's identity, were exchanged across the tiers. The language grew more hostile. Projectiles followed the insults. Presently, the rivalries of adjacent cities were being contested with cudgels in the stairwells and with blades along the passages beneath the seating, fled toward the exits. Others carried the altercation into the area outside. Merchants had established counters and youths had fashioned toy spears from sticks. The historian Tacitus, who serves as our primary source for this incident, the remainder with the detached indignation of a Roman senator. He identifies a promoter of the games, a specific Lavinius Regulus. Standing was already compromised in the capital. He portrays the injured from Nuceria staggering back to their city with incapacitated limbs and parents, searching for sons who never returned. The investigation reached Rome. The Senate responded with the complete gravity of its power. The games in Pompeii were forbidden for 10 years. The amphitheater was shuttered. The primary organizers were banished. It was a disciplinary measure intended to inflict pain and to educate. It descended not just upon individuals, but upon the civic entity that had permitted a celebration to degrade into a melee, a plaster surface, in an unassuming dwelling near the Stabian Gate. Artist bequeathed to us a depiction of the event that is as priceless as any historian's text. It is a fresco of the amphitheater, its awnings deployed like sails and the attendees in a state of turmoil. Beyond the oval, observes the canvas shelters of vendors, and the onset of disorder as men clash in the dust. The artist was not preoccupied with political theory. He was documenting an occurrence that destabilized the town, one that people still discussed while purchasing bread in the morning. Portrayal is the closest we can get to occupying the field as the shouts intensified and became malevolent. The sanction altered the cadence of civic existence. An amphitheater is more than just a location, it is a schedule. With the prohibition active, the city forfeited a routine assembly, where patrons could exhibit their benevolence and guilds could display their insignias. For a decade, sanctioned games occurred. That deprivation forced other venues into greater utilization. The theaters near the Triangular Forum assumed more of the public responsibility. Private functions and local festivals had to accommodate the energy that games previously channeled. The graffiti promoting combatants and mocking rival towns diminish in the years following the prohibition. The city absorbed a lesson regarding pride and spectacle that conflicted with its craving for a good event. No civic condemnation, however, can regulate the earth beneath a city. In the initial months of the year 62, a seismic event ripped through Campania. The philosopher and statesman Seneca, posing texts on natural phenomena, provides a measured description of the upheaval. The tremor arrived without precedent. Structures in Pompeii, Herculaneum, the coastline yielded and collapsed. Roofs imploded. Statues fell from their bases. In fountains surged in their basins, as if a colossal hand had gripped the city by its shoulders. The extensive aqueduct that transported the region's vital water supply fractured in sections. Inhabitants fled into the thoroughfares, only to discover that the streets were no more secure than the chambers they had abandoned. Pompeii's integrity was challenged at every juncture. In the Forum, colonnades fractured, leaving segments of stone dispersed across the paving. The Temple of Jupiter, which dominated the northern end of the plaza, sections of its upper structure. The tribunals and the market hall sustained impairment that necessitated not merely mending, but fundamental reassessment. The Stabian baths, the pride of a city that gauged its refinement by the standard of its bathing facilities, breaches in their pipes and fissures in their ceilings. The theaters experienced fractured stairways. In districts remote from the Forum, the destruction adhered to no predictable pattern. An imposing residence with robust walls might survive, with only plaster dislodged from its painted surfaces, while a humble workshop 2 doors down disintegrated into its own basement. The most immediate documentation of the earthquake is the archaeological evidence of mending. Within months, possibly within weeks, crews of constructors were reinforcing walls with wooden supports and repurposing any salvageable stone. Of older landmarks were exploited for pre-cut blocks. Spolia, reused materials, appear extensively in the subsequent strata. Bearing old decorative moldings are oriented inward to function as simple walling. Columns that once encircled a courtyard are sectioned and utilized as corner supports in a new facade. In certain areas, is combined with tufa in a pattern of expediency. Where the established custom had required uniform layers of local stone, Earthquake City starts to accept a composite appearance that is as telling as any text, speaks of critical need and of a populace reluctant to await flawlessness while roofs were exposed to the elements. Religion spearheaded the recovery, it frequently does following calamities. Near the theater district, the Temple of Isis emerged from the debris with renewed vitality. An inscription documents that a minor, Numerius Popidius Celsinus, reconstructed the sanctuary using his family's resources, that the city compensated him with entry into the council, despite his not having attained the requisite age. These words memorialize more than a timeline, memorialize a social reality. Freedmen and their offspring, who prospered in the commerce of this port town, could convert affluence into distinction through public patronage. The Isis temple is not merely a site of Egyptian ritual in a Campanian city. It is a testament to social advancement that the earthquake facilitated by presenting both a requirement and an opening simultaneously. In other areas, the efforts progressed incrementally. The Forum experienced constant scaffolding as colonnades were reconstructed and bases repositioned. Shops resumed operations behind supported facades, while masons continued work on the upper levels. The Mausoleum acquired a modest shrine to the imperial family, a gesture that blended allegiance with the daily procurement of fish and meat. The aqueduct restoration prioritized public fountains and baths over private residences. The Castellum Aquae, at the city's northern periphery, exhibits alterations from this era that imply a meticulous readjustment of the water flow. If the water can circulate in the street basins, the city's core functions can persist. Wall painting provides a quiet narrative of the recovery. numerous residences that had featured the refined panels of the third style, before the seismic event received a subsequent phase of embellishment in the years after 62. The artisans adopted a more flamboyant approach. Expansive architectural illusions with dramatic perspectives materialized, accompanied by a new preference for opulent color fields intersected by slender columns and framed panoramas. Researchers term this trend the fourth style. Is not solely an aesthetic movement. It is a chronological marker. It informs us that patrons allocated significant funds to reinstate beauty in chambers that had been disturbed and marred. Dining areas were revitalized so that clients and acquaintances could be entertained without the discomfort of fissured plaster and faded mythology. Shone knew where water had streamed through damaged roofs on that initial terrifying day. Industry likewise recuperated. Bakers mended their mills and returned donkeys to their rotes. The sound of the bakery is the sound of a city reviving after a trauma. Reactivated their vats with an intensity that implies not just normal operations, but a surge in necessity. Households dispatched impaired garments for cleansing and mending. Workshops along the primary thoroughfares featured new entryways with repurposed stone supports. Many of them incorporated subfloors to distribute weight on weakened foundations. In the suburban baths along the incline toward the sea, restoration yielded some of the city's most sophisticated chambers, with paintings and stucco that adopted the new trend. The decision to allocate resources to baths while temples and civic structures were still undergoing repairs reveals much about the city's priorities. Hygiene, social interaction, and the daily ritual of bathing were not extravagances in Roman existence. They were the validation of normalcy. The governing class acted swiftly to align itself with the recuperation. Electoral appeals painted on street facades in the 62nd year and beyond solicited voters with assurances of benevolence and dependability. Some contenders explicitly linked themselves with construction initiatives. The council records are lost. The stones document acknowledgments to patrons who managed the reconstruction of porticos and the mending of pavement. There is ample cause to surmise that imperial leadership demonstrated an interest as well. Nero toured Campania on multiple occasions during his rule and graced Naples with performances that attendees recalled for their originality and boldness. He visited the scaffolding in Pompeii. Is not documented. The empire's governmental apparatus understood how to direct materials and artisans toward an afflicted region when the standing of Roman order necessitated it. The years following the earthquake were characterized by subsequent tremors that served as reminders to the inhabitants that the ground had not reverted to its prior stability. Shudders rattled doors and sent people into courtyards until the disturbances subsided. The historic city wall, previously a tool of defense, assumed a new function as a support for dwellings that rested against it. In multiple sections, the interior faces of the wall were assimilated with domestic structures in a manner implying a conscious utilization of the ancient masonry to reinforce new construction. Was pragmatic engineering in an unpredictable world. The prohibition on games concluded, and after its conclusion, the amphitheater resumed operations to acclaim. The painting of the disturbance remained in its humble dwelling, domestic caution of what can transpire when civic ego surpasses civic accountability. The resumption of games did not nullify the memory of the Senate's censure. It reinforced the city's desire for order. Attendants and officials were more prominent at public events. Seating allocations were monitored more closely. The same fervor that had previously incited men to violence under the awnings now motivated patrons to finance safer passages and more robust partitions. Spectacle endured, but it operated under a more rigorous regulation. By the late 60s, the city had achieved significant advancement, recovered its cohesion. Theaters were operational. Baths steamed anew each evening. In the countryside yielded vintages that merchants at Puteoli readily distributed. Nonetheless, the blemishes of 62 remained apparent in 79. The mountain finally expressed itself in fire. Column segments in the forum were not yet entirely repositioned. A number of opulent residences show chambers in the midst of redecoration, containers of pigment left accessible for artisans who never came back to complete their tasks. Provisional walls, erected as immediate solutions, persisted where permanent mending had been deferred, or where resources had proven insufficient. It is one of the poignant ironies of Pompeii's preservation that we can observe this incomplete status with such clarity. The calamity that entombed the city suspended both its accomplishments and its intentions. From these years, a depiction of tenacity emerges that is as enlightening as any celebratory inscription. A community that had been disciplined by the Senate for a turbulent episode learned to regulate its pride. City that had been fractured by an earthquake learned to reconstruct nearly everything significant. Achieved this through adaptation and adherence to established forms. Repurposed stones with a pragmatism that would have shocked earlier artisans, but satisfied any practical constructor. Venerated the gods with refurbished temples. It restored water to its fountains. It repainted its chambers in the prevailing style, because elegance is not trivial when a household needs to feel intact again. It resumed visiting the bath, the theater, and, in time, the games. Public celebration is the sanctuary of a wounded location. If we aim to assess Pompeii before the ultimate disaster, comprehend these years of turmoil and recuperation. They disclose a populace capable of self-control after humiliation and of unified action after calamity. Is the city we observe on the brink of the eruption. Its stones retain the memory of a riot and the wounds of an earthquake. And yet, streets are bustling, and its schedule is occupied. Commence at dawn in the Forum, when the paving blocks still retain the evening's coolness. The plaza is an extended rectangle bordered by porticos and public edifices, a deliberate arena for the ceremonies of civic existence. Agriculturalists from the Sano plain arrive initially, with containers secured across the backs of donkeys. Subsequently, owners raise their shutters and cleans their entryways. Then, the assistants to the magistrates assume their positions beneath the basilica's eaves. Possesses a location and a schedule. Public activity in Pompeii was a performance perfected over generations. Its movements remain legible in the stone. The Forum consolidated the city's vital operations. At the northern conclusion, the massive podium of Jupiter signified authority, a temple whose steps overlooked the plaza, and whose altar received sacrifices on days when the council and the populace petitioned for affluence. Along the western perimeter, the basilica extended as a measured hall with a central nave and aisles, where legal advocates argued, financiers conferred with clients, and agreements were finalized under the observation of officials. The southern and eastern flanks supported porticos, which were situated offices and storage areas, and in some instances, ceremonial rooms for priestly associations, or for guilds that paid fees and derived status from their location. Modest statues stood on inscribed pedestals at the plaza's corners, reminders that the city venerated those who contributed generously for its enhancement. The principle was straightforward and overt. If you desired to be recalled, you invested in the vitality of the Forum. Near the northeastern intersection, the Masalum converted that principle into the mundane activity of sustenance, a sheltered marketplace with an array of tabernae and a central tholos where inspectors verified the weight of meat and fish. Marble counters display the grooves from blades and the shallow indentations where scales were positioned. The vendors opened early. Freshness constituted a competition against the Campanian sun. Fish merchants transported eels and small tuna from the bay at sunrise, exhibited cuts from regional herds raised on valley pastures. Fruit vendors organized figs, pears, late-season grapes into displays designed to entice a prudent homemaker into spending an additional coin. The Macellum also served as a center of integrity, and measures were verified against official benchmarks, maintained by the aediles, and dishonesty at the scale was a swift road to a penalty, transformed the Forum into a place of comfort, as well as commerce. Fountains were situated at the intersections and on adjacent streets, plied by the Castellum Aquae on the northern elevation. Bronze fixtures dispensed water into stone cisterns, crowned by supports where individuals could set down a vessel while it filled. The distribution conduits beneath the pavement had been calibrated by technicians who comprehended hydraulics and prioritization. Fountains and baths received the initial allocation. Only after those requirements were satisfied did water flow to the residences of the affluent. Hierarchy is apparent in the quantity and positioning of cisterns. Even the most modest districts were a brief stroll from a source. Children learned to transport amphorae without spillage, and to await their opportunity when a line developed on a warm afternoon. Thoroughfares surrounding the forum functioned as the city's lifelines. They were surfaced with substantial stone blocks. Grooves still document generations of wagon traffic. Stepping stones positioned at intervals permitted walkers to traverse when drainage channels flowed after cleansing or precipitation, were elevated and frequently smoothed at the corners to prevent iron-rimmed wheels from damaging them. Bollards restricted the entrances to specific lanes, preventing heavy transport from passing through rapidly. Traffic regulations were based more on convention than legislation, but an observer could discern routines. Transported goods inward during the early morning and outward in the late afternoon. Merchants arranged goods at their entryways until laborers could carry them inside. The ambient sound was constant and functional. Iron tires on stone, the drone of mills from bakeries, vendors announcing prices, a hammer from an atelier where a hinge or fastener was being mended. Commerce thrived in numerous small establishments. A taberna was a compact unit with a broad entryway to the street, and frequently a rear chamber for inventory or habitation. Merchants displayed vessels embedded in counters and dispensed measures into cups. Thermopolia maintained the warmth of stews and vended servings to laborers who did not go home for their midday meal. Shoemakers sat on benches and adjusted sandals while patrons waited at the entrance. Workers sculpted chair legs and buffed small containers made from olive or maple wood. Along the routes approaching the amphitheater, catering to festival attendees, arranged inexpensive refreshments and clay cups on shelving, ready to accommodate crowds that could triple the usual pedestrian volume. In the theater district, merchants earned a livelihood from walnuts, pork preparations, seating pads that a weary attendee could lease for a minor sum. The city comprehended how to convert leisure into revenue. Administration and public decorum were the responsibilities of officials and their aides. The duovari managed tribunals and led the council. Aediles supervised streets, fountains, markets, and standards. Attendants enforced summonses and maintained a degree of order in congested areas. The council, the Ordo Decurionum, convened in the Curia near the Forum and deliberated on agreements, maintenance, and accolades. Records of their edicts persist in texts that acknowledge patrons for constructing stairways, mending porticos, or funding celebrations. Freedmen were ineligible to serve on the council. They could acquire status and a route to power by affiliating with priestly colleges like the Augustales, and by sponsoring diversions that publicized their names to the populace. Electoral appeals painted on stuccoed facades illustrate how vigorous this politics of renown could be. Their expanses of walls are adorned with solicitations urging backing for a contender portrayed as principled, unassuming, a reliable food provider, a steadfast guardian of public decorum. Neighbors, guilds, and even tavern patrons advocated collectively. The paint is simultaneously conventional and personal, applied during the night by specialized advertisers who understood where a solicitation would attract the most attention the following day. Religion structured the schedule of public existence. The Forum accommodated processions that navigated from one temple to another, featuring officials in white and youths bearing incense, with hymns ascending above the sound of sandaled feet. The Temple of Jupiter governed state rituals. The Temple of Venus on the western prominence received sailors and merchants who pledged oblations for a safe arrival. The sanctuary of Apollo along the Forum's western edge served worshippers who blended ancient Italic reverence with Greek ceremony. In the theater quadrant, the Temple of Isis attracted a distinct attendance with music and rites that had journeyed from Egypt through the Greek world to Campania. Devotion and assimilated cults did not necessarily clash. Rather, they harmonized, provided a method to connect inhabitants to the city and to each other. Public pledges, accompanied by feasts, tools of societal cohesion as potent as any statute. The venues for amusement occupied the remainder of the civic schedule. The large theater accommodated thousands in a semicircular area carved into the southern incline, offering comedies and musical presentations during the season. Covered theater nearby presented recitations, concerts, and civic functions. Patrons like the Holconi and the Antisti financed upgrades that secured their names on stairwells and balustrades. To the east, beyond the city fortification, the amphitheater was prepared for events that combined bravery, ceremony, and public craving. Gladiatorial academies supplied proficient combatants. Animal exhibitions featured creatures most inhabitants would never encounter otherwise. It was clamorous and occasionally chaotic. It also served as an environment where the city absorbed the protocols of an organized assembly, following the disturbance of '59 and the Senate's prohibition. Attendants and officials heightened their oversight. The prohibition concluded and events resumed. Patrons financed safer transit routes and partitions. The arena reverted to its intended purpose, balanced civic pride with communal celebration. Hygiene and social interaction converged at the bathhouses. Stabian baths catered to the southern districts with a series of chambers, organized around a palastra. Forum baths provided a central choice for the preoccupied. The suburban baths, terraced above the coastal road, offered sophisticated chambers where light and murals merged with heat and cold to generate an experience that was simultaneously rejuvenating and communal. Admission fees were minimal and occasionally waived by patrons on festival days. The progression through the chambers established a routine: tepidarium to acclimate the body, caldarium to perspire and purify, frigidarium to invigorate. Then, a return to the palastra for oil, scraping, and conversation. Information and speculation circulated through these areas as swiftly as vapor. A city that bathes collectively twice daily is a city that disseminates intelligence with exceptional rapidity. Must not overlook the minor technologies that facilitated dense public existence. Public sanitation facilities near the forum and in the baths utilized flowing water beneath communal seating, and featured basins at the entryway for cleansing sponges. Street maintenance workers were employed to guide refuse toward gutters and out through the gates. Waste could be applied to fields or deposited in excavations. Urine collection vessels positioned at intersections gathered the base ingredient for the fullers, paid for its collection, and processed it into a cleansing agent for textiles. Fire hazards were mitigated by daytime prohibitions on open flames in specific areas, and by the practice of preparing food in shops, rather than in confined upper chambers. In warm seasons, coverings were suspended over sections of the forum and above seating in the amphitheater to render assemblies tolerable. Shop identifiers, or sculpted above entryways, promoted trades with symbols recognizable to the non-literate. A denarius and a handshake could resolve more issues than any document. Graffiti represent the most intimate record of this public sphere. Thousands persist, incised into plaster. Some are political endorsements. Some are jests. Some are boasts by paramours who desired a wall to recall them. A person passing through a lane near the forum might see a line praising a baker's product, an actor's talent, or a favored gladiator's triumphs. A merchant might document a loan or a shipment on a column adjacent to his counter, trusting that the notation would be understood, and perhaps even honored, till he returned with a brush to formalize it. These inscriptions are the pocket change of dialogue in a city that depended on voices and observation, rather than parchment and seals. Heritage was embedded in routines as much as in landmarks. Processions traversed the same routes on ceremonial days, assembled on the same benches beneath the same porticos. Voters proceeded to the same side streets during elections, clerks awaited with records and officials with tablets. Children learned to use the same stepping stones when traversing a busy lane. A town that reiterates these actions for generations develops a sense of identity that no oration can match. The stones of Pompeii inculcated citizenship through practice. At midday, the forum's population dwindles. Shadows contract beneath the colonnades, secure documents, and head to the baths. Merchants partially close their shutters and dine in the coolness of rear chambers. The plaza becomes quiet, save for the constant flow at the fountains and the hum from the macellum, where late shoppers negotiate over the remaining items on the counters. Afternoon. The lanes are active again, time with wagons proceeding outward, and with children heading toward the palastra to observe older youths practicing wrestling. At twilight, illuminate shopfronts and arches. The city does not retire early. There are feasts to join, taverns to frequent, music from the theaters on festival evenings. The Forum in the diminishing light possesses the serenity of a location that recognizes it has merited its repose. Public existence in Pompeii was not a theoretical concept of marble and statute. It was the aggregation of 1,000 habitual actions, procuring water at the neighborhood basin, voting for a neighbor whose benevolence was established, purchasing figs beneath the roof of a market that carried the scent of salt and stone, praying at a platform where the gods had observed generations pass, celebrating and mourning collectively in venues where the city assessed its own character. These customs forged a civic entity that could withstand sanctions and earthquakes. Yet resume each morning to open the shutters and cleanse the steps, a street entrance in Pompeii, and you access a domain structured for presentation, obligation, and reverence. The typical dwelling presented an unassuming facade to the street, revealing little. Internally, the space unfolded sequentially. A confined passage directed the guest into the atrium, the primary chamber exposed to the sky. Rain descended through a quadrilateral aperture and pooled in a shallow cistern. Light reflected off the water, illuminating painted walls. Ancestral portraits or bronze figures were positioned at the distant end. This configuration enacted a societal ceremony that every family comprehended. Dependents arrived at sunrise to honor the head of the household. Supplicants awaited in the cool shadows beneath the roof structure. Children observed servants traversing the polished entryways, transporting containers of fruit, oil, and bread. The residence itself taught social strata and welcome through its very design. Pompeii adorned these chambers with artistry that advocated for culture in pigment and stone. Mosaic flooring varied from elementary black and white motifs to costly panels demanding a master's expertise. The most celebrated in the city, the combat depiction from the House of the Faun, utilized tens of thousands of tiles to portray a frantic clash between monarchs and victors. In other areas, modest dwellings featured small symbols at the doorway, occasionally a theatrical mask, sometimes a fish or a grapevine, sometimes a caution in tesserae that a contemporary observer cannot overlook without amusement. Cave Canem, the floor declared, canine strained against its tether. The house communicated before its inhabitants spoke. Wall painting extended the assertion. In the late Republic, the preferred trend was what researchers term the second style, dramatic device of painted architecture that expanded walls visually into imagined colonnades and remote gardens. Under Augustus, a new preference gained prominence. Artisans framed diminutive scenes on monochrome backgrounds, suspended refined panels, applied delicate lines like adornments on deep red, black, or yellow surfaces. This third style prioritized subtlety and sophistication. In the years following the earthquake of 62, a more flamboyant mode emerged. The fourth style fused illusion with embellishment, erected theatrical backdrops and ethereal columns, and populated rooms with vibrant panoramas and mythological narratives that invited sustained observation, can move from dwelling to dwelling and interpret the trends, as if leafing through a family's pictorial history. One residence in particular demonstrates what new affluence sought to convey. The House of the Veti was owned by two freedmen who had amassed wealth through commerce. They invested that wealth into a domicile that orchestrated admiration. At the vestibule, a painted representation of Priapus assessed prosperity on a balance and signaled abundance. The atrium was revitalized with a lustrous marble table and bronze figures. Beyond it, the peristyle garden was transformed into a spectacle of water and foliage, projected streams into basins. Garden plots were defined with boxwood and myrtle. Replicas of renowned Greek sculptures were positioned among the greenery. In the dining chambers, the walls narrated perilous tales, brutalized by the ecstatic women of Dionysus, Ixion secured to a wheel, Cupids depicted as vintners and metalworkers in whimsical friezes that alluded to commerce transformed into leisure. Nothing in this space was accidental. Guests departed the residence with an understanding of ambition and a certainty that the city's freedmen understood how to live like full citizens. The domestic realm also served as a nexus of devotion. At the periphery of the atrium, or within the garden court, existed the lararium, a domestic altar that ranks among the most commonplace features in Pompeii. A painted alcove or a small platform supported figures of the family's protective spirits and the genius of the household head. Coiling serpents, signifying fertility and defense, approached offerings placed on a ledge. The family presented modest oblations of wine, an incense, here a wreath for the new year, a petition before a trip, a pledge fulfilled upon a safe return. These images are ubiquitous, and they communicate with the same tranquil voice. The sacred cohabits with the family and safeguards the entrance. Religion connected the residents to the thoroughfare. Neighborhood intersections stood altars dedicated to the layers of the district. Augustus, keen to merge domestic and imperial devotion, had associated these regional spirits with the fortunes of the governing dynasty. In Pompeii, the Collegia of Augustales, frequently headed by affluent freedmen, maintained these altars and coordinated processions, where the neighborhood transformed into a unified assembly. On ceremonial days, the entrances of dwellings were adorned with foliage. Children transported baskets of blossoms. Officials and priests in white tunics proceeded through streets where coverings provided shade and music marked the cadence. A city cannot subsist by taxation and statutes alone. It also requires a schedule of sacred duties that instructs people to unite. The culinary and storage areas complete the domestic scene. Many residences featured compact cooking zones with a masonry hearth and a small oven, vessels darkened by prolonged use, and jars embedded in counters to store grain, oil, or preserved fruit. Bronze cauldrons and skillets dangled from supports. Terracotta lamps with a solitary wick illuminated the activity. In certain homes, carbonized residues have captured a moment not intended for observation. Scored for baking remained in ovens. A collection of silver awaited on a shelf. A set of keys still imprinted in a cluster of ash. These minutiae are not invasive. They are the substance of everyday existence, the modest implements by which a family sustained itself and asserted its position in the world. The Pompeian dwelling possessed a secondary function as a commercial hub. Shopfronts faced the street from the identical structure that contained a sophisticated atrium and peristyle. A wine bar might occupy the corner, while the proprietor's family resided just rooms away. A baker operated millstones with the consistent aid of donkeys in an active rear courtyard. Children studied their letters from an instructor in the atrium. A fuller, possessing troughs for textiles and containers of potent, smelling ammonia, might lease space adjacent to a fine residence and contribute part of the payment in services. The city intermingled classes and professions with a liberty that contrasts sharply with modern zoning. The design of the house facilitated this. The chambers closest to the pavement accommodated commerce and clientele. The chambers beyond the courtyard provided sanctuary for family and rituals. Gardens were not solely decorative. Archaeologists have restored several peristyles utilizing pollen and seed data gathered from the original beds. The outcomes provide us with hedges of myrtle and boxwood, plane trees cultivated for shade, laurels and roses, lilies and violets, the gentle sound of water that transforms heat into melody. In some gardens, fish ponds sustained mullet or carp. In others, the fragrance of herbs wafted from plots cultivated with savory plants for the kitchen. Households employed gardeners who sculpted topiaries and maintained clear fountains. Yet, even humble dwellings incorporated a green area where birds moved among statues and sunlight shimmered on a small pool. The garden connected the residents to the rural landscape and brought the essence of the farms into the urban core. Beyond the fortifications, extended domestic artistry and comfort to their peak. Along the routes to the sea and the river, suburban and rural properties merged production with leisure. Pressing chambers equipped with beams and screws converted grapes into wine and olives into oil. Areas lined with large jars held the annual yield. Reception halls framed expansive views toward the bay and captured breezes in summer. The Boscorial treasure, a collection of silver from a villa north of Pompeii, traits the appearance of dining service when a patron aimed to impress visitors with exquisite cups and bowls. The Villa of Mysteries, situated just beyond the Herculaneum Gate, contains a painted cycle that has fascinated generations. Deep red walls feature life-sized figures progressing through a sequence that many interpret as depicting women undergoing initiation into the rites of Dionysus. Attendants, a seated noblewoman, a child holding a text, a figure recoiling in alarm from a deity in goat skin. All perform a narrative that academics persistently analyze. Regardless of its exact interpretation, the chamber informed visitors that the proprietors could retain the most skilled painters and were comfortable with a spirituality that pledged a distinct form of renewal. Burial customs linked domestic identity to the community's collective memory. Outside the gates, along the roads leading into the countryside, flanked the pathways in a structural statement of remembrance. Necropolis near the Herculaneum Gate includes benches where the living could repose during commemorative feasts, inscriptions that declare the merits of the deceased. Freedmen asserted spaces for their families with evident pride. Cult organizations offered a location for members lacking descendants to be recalled. Vary from modest altar-shaped memorials to imposing semicircular benches and tower-like edifices with alcoves for urns. The parentalia, the yearly observance for honoring the deceased, reunited families at these tombs with provisions and wine. The city derived its sense of citizenship from its deceased, as well as from its ramparts. Shops and residences displayed emblems that combined protection and levity with commerce. Representations of the phallus appear on facades and in floor mosaics as crude jests, but as tokens of fortune and procreation. Medusa heads confronted entryways to repel malevolent influences. Mercury, the god of commerce, frequently appears in modest bronze or painted representations. Fortuna is depicted with her rudder and cornucopia in shops where fortune and abundance were persistent concerns. These images do not seem transcendent. They seem domestic and functional, components of a visual language, where a figure on a wall could influence the tenor of a day. The city's renowned lupanar illustrates another facet of this blend of art and utility. The small chambers with stone beds and painted vignettes above the doors were not concealed in a clandestine realm. They were integrated into the city's fabric as one amenity among many. Prices incised into the plaster convey a straightforward narrative. Do the jests and taunts exchanged in graffiti by patrons and workers. A moralist might perceive offense. A historian perceives a candor that helps clarify why religion in Pompeii was so profoundly integrated into daily habits. A city acknowledges every human impulse as part of its existence, requires a substantial framework of ritual and moderation to remind individuals of order and obligation. Domestic artifacts finalize the depiction, featuring scenes of gods, creatures, and lovers, glass vessels in hues of green and blue that captured the afternoon light, cooking vessels hammered thin for rapid heating, portable altars equipped with small doors that could be secured when work started and reopened in the evening, children's playthings in wood and clay, and game pieces lost in floor crevices, tools with handles worn smooth by an artisan's grip. These are not relics for veneration. They are functional items that serve their purpose effectively. Pompeii's dwellings were not simply refuges. They were hubs of social interaction and showcases of art. They instructed dependents and children in the principles of hierarchy. They exhibited taste and aspiration to neighbors and competitors. They connected families to deities at altars that shimmered with candle smoke. They intertwined private existence through shopfronts that faced streets brimming with information. When the mountain quieted at night, continued to burn before the Lararia, and voices whispered petitions that the gods would maintain their vigil until sunrise. The city that materializes from these chambers is a community self, assured enough to invest in elegance, and regulated enough to weave spirituality through every duty, from producing bread to campaigning for office. The city that commenced the Flavian dynasty had already demonstrated its resilience, had been disciplined for a disturbance, and it had been fractured by an earthquake. Yet, every morning, the shutters were still raised, the fountains continued to flow, and the mills kept rotating under the persistent pull of donkeys. Vespasian prevailed in the arduous competition of the four emperors in the year 60. 9. Pompeii found itself existing under a regime that valued order and restoration. The new dynasty's governance of Campania was not limited to grand edicts. Influence manifested in stonemasons' wages, lime provisions, roadwork contracts, the systematic rehabilitation of the water infrastructure that connected the bay's towns. Stability, once again, was quantifiable in stonework. Following the earthquake of 62, the aqueduct supplying Pompeii and its neighbors demanded relentless upkeep. The Castellum Aquae on the northern elevation, a functional stone tower where the city could monitor its own vitality, displays evidence of readjustments made in the late 60s and early 70s. Technicians modified the outputs for fountains and baths, reduced private connections where supply was limited, and restored public basins to consistent operation. The water flowed. Other routines resumed. Bath furnaces were fed at midday and again in the evening's coolness. Bakers rinsed their floors after the final batches were removed. Fullers transported pails to their vats and commenced work on the innumerable garments a dynamic city dirties daily. The restoration of water pressure was more than a utility. It was a testament that the city refused to subsist on buckets drawn from wells. The Forum serves as a record of these years. Damaged colonnades were reconstructed with composite materials. Old segments faced inward, new sections faced outward, finished with meticulous stucco. The Temple of Jupiter on its northern platform recovered much of its stature, even if some columns remained truncated, awaiting capitals that were never installed. The Basilica at the southwestern intersection resumed its roles as tribunal and financial center. The Macellum fully reopened. A modest shrine within it venerated the imperial family with understated devotion. Butchers arranged meat on marble counters, and fish merchants displayed eels and mackerel on damp foliage. The Eumachia building again facilitated the commerce, favored by the textile guilds, evidence that the reliable currency of trade often follows closely after calamity, when labor is available and markets are receptive. Amusement also reverted to a regular schedule. Year prohibition imposed by the Senate after the disturbance in 59 concluded at the decade's turn. With its expiration, the amphitheater resumed operations to the acclaim of a populace that had been compelled to recall how fragile the boundary is between pride and disorder. The resumption did not nullify vigilance. Attendants and officials monitored the assembly with stricter regulation, financed more robust partitions and safer passages. On festival days, the adjacent field again filled with canvas shelters and small merchants who subsisted on the margin between what an audience would purchase before an event and what it could be convinced to purchase afterward. Theaters in the city's southern part fulfilled their own function. Upgrades to the stage structure and seating served as reminders to attendees that the benevolence of local elites was a vernacular, all comprehended. The residences narrate the history most personally. In the years after 62 and during the Flavian period, proprietors hired painters to adorn their chambers with the flamboyant illusions researchers term the fourth style. The House of the Vetii represents the most refined expression of that preference. Two brothers, both freedmen, who had transitioned from the laboring world to the ranks of the affluent, populated their chambers with mythology, framed their gardens with fountains and sculptures, and positioned at their entrance an image of Priapus, balancing a pouch of currency against his own symbol, if affluence itself could be gauged on a scale. Numerous dwellings, not solely the most opulent, exhibit analogous assurance. Dining chambers gleam with panels on red and black backgrounds, their small vignettes of heroes and nymphs, embedded like gemstones. Porticos overlook replanted plots of myrtle and boxwood, where water splashes from bronze fixtures. The city opted to counter the unstable ground with elegance. The countryside responded with goods. Grapevines ascended trained supports on the mountain's lower inclines, and across the plain, trees reverted to consistent production. Pressing facilities in villas beyond the walls operated long hours during the harvest season. Earthenware vessels, embedded to their rims in the floors of storage areas, kept wine and oil cool. Designated for export, were arrayed near the river port, marked with identifiers naming the producer and year. Some displayed the names of families already renowned in Pompeii for their sauces and relishes. Said Puteoli recognized the weight and aroma of these containers. Operators on the Sano understood the sound they made when cargo shifted with a change in the current. Grain also arrived from inland farms. Even a productive city depended on other regions for essential supplies when the local yield was insufficient. Connected these activities to the broader world. Agreements for loans, collateralized by merchandise and real estate, endure in multiple household records. Even where documentation is absent, the custom is evident. A vintner could secure financing against a harvest still in the field. A shipper could use cargo on a barge as collateral for a brief transit to the bay. A constructor could obtain a loan against forthcoming payments from a public agreement to mend a colonnade. In such dealings, city evaluated the robustness of its frameworks. Tribunals that could resolve a conflict quickly, standards of weight and measure that commanded buyers' trust, and officials who maintained streets and fountains in proper condition were not extravagances. They were the prerequisites for capital investment. Religion supplied significance and structure to this recuperation. The Temple of Isis, reconstructed after the earthquake with resources from a family of freedmen, and sanctified by the elevation of a youth to the city council as compensation for his family's benevolence, stood near the theater district as a potent emblem that historic barriers in status could be surmounted through public patronage. The sanctuary attracted mariners and merchants who had absorbed its rituals in Alexandria and along the Levantine coast. At the Forum, the established sanctuaries resumed their customary ceremonial life. The imperial cult, integrated into civic functions since the Augustan era, gained renewed prominence under Vespasian and Titus. Festivals honoring concord and the fortuna of the governing dynasty expressed allegiance through garlands and music. Priests of the Augustales, frequently men who had advanced from servitude to affluence, held prominent positions. They dressed in white and proceeded with the officials. Their names appeared alongside those of the established families on statue pedestals. Piety in these years served as a societal adhesive. Nothing in this rebuilding process precluded companions from attending to Rome. Information arrived in Pompeii via sailors at the port and travelers on the coastal route, extending to Naples and onward to the capital. Individuals in the Forum could have followed the developments of the siege of Jerusalem and the subsequent triumph of Titus, might even have observed exotic captives or creatures destined for festivals passing through the area en route to larger arenas. Currency minted with the inscription Judea Capta found its way into purses and containers. The memory of civic humiliation in 59 and the trauma of 62 became elements of a larger narrative in which the empire endured civil conflict and re-established its authority with processions and consistent taxation. If these years appear tranquil superficially, they also contain subtle alerts. Seneca had cautioned after 62 that Campania should anticipate further tremors. He did not propose a hypothesis of magma and fissures. He offered the pragmatic insight that a region experiencing a major shock would probably experience a sequence of minor ones. Pliny the Elder, fascination with wonders, never obscured his grasp of practical realities. In his natural history about the area's volcanic soils and the polishing agents derived from pumice, substance so prevalent on the bay's shores that it became part of daily existence as a material for smoothing wood and refining skin. The very productivity of the land originated from a source no Roman could perceive. They could only sense it. The final approach to the disaster is best comprehended from a Roman perspective. They did not classify the geology of their territory. They classified their gods. They interpreted earthquakes as manifestations of divine anger and reacted with pledges and processions. When the ground shifted in that concluding week, they presented their offerings, reinforced their doorframes, and continued their activities. On the evening prior to the conclusion, a more powerful tremor forced people from their beds into courtyards and streets. They kept lamps burning and conversed with neighbors while the ground stabilized. At sunrise, they went back to their kitchens and shops. The day commenced as every day does in a city that trusts in its own persistence. Is the most moving aspect of Pompeii in the Flavian era. It had reconstructed, it had repainted, it had replanted, it had resumed nearly every activity that imparts significance to urban existence. It had incorporated freedmen into its honors, provided young men with theaters and arenas to display bravery, reinstated temples that pledged order and favor, and secured water that standardized hygiene and comfort. It understood the earth trembled periodically, and it had resolved to coexist with that awareness, just as farmers coexist with frost and sailors with tempests. The final decade is not a narrative of apprehension. It is the documentation of a community that maintained its composure and occupied its days. The morning commenced as numerous mornings had in that tenacious decade. Bakers retrieved the initial loaves, fullers agitated paddles in their vats, and the fountains, at the forum's intersections, murmured their constant solace. Midday, a plume ascended above the mountain. To an inhabitant positioned in the forum, must have resembled a pine tree emerging from the peak. A slender trunk of ash and gas expanding into a wide canopy, precisely as Pliny the Younger would subsequently document from the naval base at Misenum across the bay. The wind direction, blowing from the north and west, propelled the descending matter toward Pompeii. The initial projectiles were insubstantial and pale pumice fragments as large as a hand, clattered on terracotta roofing and rebounded in the thoroughfares. Shortly thereafter, darker stones ensued, accompanied by fine ash. A persistent hiss intensified into a roar that never fully subsided until it was too late to escape. For generations, readers accepted the historic date of the calamity from the manuscripts of Pliny's correspondence, which state the day as the 9th before the calends of September, August 24th. The Earth, however, maintains a separate timeline. Archaeological findings within the city have accumulated indicators of autumn, pomegranates and walnuts in storage areas, braziers positioned for evening coolness, amphorae opened for a recently completed processing of fish sauce, a charcoal inscription in a residence undergoing repairs, dated to October 17th. A brief notation that could not have been made if the chambers were already inundated. Numerous researchers now advocate for a late October date. The specific day is less critical than the complex picture that materializes. The year was in its final harvest, the city that had spent 17 years reconstructing itself. After the earthquake of 1962 was overtaken with scaffolding in place, paint containers open, projects incomplete. The eruption, which volcanologists now designate as Plinian in honor of the witness who documented it, occurred in stages that the city's stratification still preserves. For an extended period, possibly through the remainder of the day, and the initial portion of the night, pumice and ash descended without interruption. In districts closer to the mountain, the accumulation reached 2 or 3 cubits in just a few hours. Roofs, weakened by the preceding earthquake, strained and then gave way. Porticos collapsed inward. Anyone opting to remain sheltered indoors had to perpetually clear the debris or relocate, as chambers failed successively. Many did not attempt it. Footprints preserved in the ash reveal the initial exodus. People navigated along the primary streets toward the gates, transporting children and small containers shielded against the particles, aspiring to reach the coastal road or the river port before the accumulation deepened, retreated to internal courtyards and awaited the cessation of the downfall. In the pre-dawn obscurity, the nature of the violence shifted. The plume above the volcano lost its upward force and disintegrated. What descended were torrents of ash and intensely heated gas, pyroclastic flows that clung to the terrain and traveled faster than any human could move. Herculaneum, on the western slope and nearer to the source, had already been engulfed by preceding pyroclastic events. At Pompeii, the initial flows barely reached the walls and receded. Subsequent flows were more powerful and elevated. They breached the gates and inundated the streets. The individuals who had endured the night by clearing pumice from roofs or seeking refuge in basements perished instantly. Plaster replicas, created generations later, document the contortions of those concluding seconds. Positioning of mouths and hands implies that many succumbed to the intensely hot, ash-laden atmosphere that obstructed breathing and scorched the lungs. In other locations, the end resulted from weight and structural failure rather than temperature. Beams yielded under the burden of ash and stone. The surrounding rooms imploded. Tomes beyond the walls recount analogous narratives. The ash accumulated around memorials and then surged, peculiar scalloped contours that a geologist can interpret like a meteorological chart. Pliny the Elder, admiral and scholar, navigated from Misenum into this cataclysm. He instructed warships to be readied, planning to deliver assistance and observe the event at close proximity. He arrived at the southern coastline of the bay near Stabia, calmed acquaintances, and observed the plume escalating, punctuated by fire. During the night, he attempted to rest, but the courtyard's ash accumulation became so profound that the departing group secured pillows to their heads as improvised protection. He never went back to Misenum. His nephew reports that the elder Pliny succumbed on the shore, overcome by gases and physical strain. The nephew's correspondence to the historian Tacitus constitutes our most meticulous ancient record, possesses the tone of a young man who witnessed the world's geography alter in a single day, and who, through description, the order that nature had revoked. When the pyroclastic flows concluded, the mountain continued to expel ash and vapor. Where the city had stood, there was now an undulating expanse of gray, no longer aligned with the previous landmarks. Sporadically, ridges indicated where roofs had been. Much later, mentioned survivors, coming back to locate entryways, or a family repository. In some areas, they excavated shafts and passages, retrieving what they could. The most renowned loaves from a baker's oven display an embossed seal, and deep incisions for simple partitioning. They were already prepared when the downfall commenced. Beyond the Herculaneum Gate, a small contingent of people attempted to escape through a vineyard and perished together when the final flows arrived. Their garden has immortalized them. In other districts, a dog perished, still tethered, contorted by its final struggle, which the plaster replica has fixed in agonizing detail. The turmoil that started at midday had transformed by the following afternoon into a sealed environment. Above Pompeii rested several meters of volcanic deposit, at the base and ash on top, consolidated by subsequent precipitation into a layer that no plow could readily penetrate. The ancient world lost recollection of the city's identity. The location was known as La Civet. The old town, it rested beneath vineyards and fields that drew sustenance from the very soil that had supported Pompeii during its existence. In the late 16th century, architect named Domenico Fontana excavated a conduit across the submerged area to transport water for a new estate. He exposed painted walls and texts, but did not pause. The initial organized exploration commenced under the Bourbon monarchs of Naples in the 18th century. Efforts started at Herculaneum in the year 1738, and shortly relocated to the more accessible terrain of Pompeii. In 1748, the earliest excavation resembled a quest for valuables more than a scientific endeavor. Tunnels were dug toward painted chambers, and marbles were retrieved as prizes for royal collections. Baroque Europe craved antiquity, and Pompeii satisfied that craving. Methodology succeeded avarice. Engineers such as Carl Jacob Weber and later Francesco La Vega implemented plans and meticulous documentation. They recognized that a complete city was being revealed, with its thoroughfares, water infrastructure, and shops preserved, that only methodical exposure could safeguard its significance. In the year 1763, stone text bearing the phrase of the city's governing body validated the name Pompeii. Throughout Europe, the revelation sparked an impassioned scholarship that combined exploration, aesthetic judgment, and detailed chronicling. The paintings and mosaics attracted antiquarian interest, but it was the mundane artifacts of existence that captivated the imagination. Cooking vessels, keys, stools, and lamps gave substance to the framework of Latin texts. The House of the Faun yielded its renowned mosaic depicting Alexander confronting the Persian monarch. The Villa of Mysteries, outside the Herculaneum Gate, a red-walled chamber whose life-sized fresco sequence has prompted interpretations for generations. Visitors began to arrive, patronage launched careers. A city recently deceased provided many modern individuals with their professions. The 19th century provided Pompeii with its paramount coordinator. In 1860, Giuseppe Fiorelli took command, and shifted the operation from extraction to archaeology. He partitioned the city into regions and sectors, assigning every entrance a numeral, a straightforward method that converted a labyrinth into a grid. He documented significant discoveries and disseminated reports that rendered the work verifiable. Most notably, he attempted a humane experiment. Confronted with a cavity in the ash where a body had decomposed, he introduced liquid plaster and allowed it to solidify. When the matrix was removed, he found himself observing a human form, with features and clothing impressed into the replica. This technique, still employed with contemporary modifications, altered the ethical atmosphere of the location. The deceased were no longer mere entries in a log. They were individuals captured in their concluding moments. Among the initial casts were those of a contingent who perished in a garden near the Porta Nocera, subsequently named the Garden of the Fugitives. They are positioned in postures that require no explanation. Fiorelli's inheritors expanded upon his system. Vittorio Spinazzola, in the early 20th century, to excavate street frontages continuously, posing entire commercial facades with entrances and balconies in a progression that illustrated how a functional street appeared. A generation later, Amedeo Maiori directed extensive projects between the 1920s and the 1960s, covering major residences, such as the House of the Menander and the House of the Surgeon, and linking architectural progression to the town's extended narrative, from its Samnite origins to its colonial reorganization. The Second World War inflicted damage from bombs that fragmented areas already uncovered. Post-war preservation efforts had to address impairments from both ancient times and the modern era. In 1997, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization designated Pompeii, Herculanum, and the villas of Torre Annunziata as a World Heritage Site, acknowledging that the ash had preserved not just art and structures, but an entire urban ecosystem unparalleled in the Roman world. Archaeology has subsequently acquired new vocabularies at Pompeii. The vegetation in peristyle gardens is no longer restored based solely on preference. Analysis and seed catalogs from cavities in the earth permit accurate replanting of myrtle hedges, fruit trees, and herbs. Botanists have demonstrated how vineyards were configured and how the city cultivated specific crops in small courtyards to enhance its cuisine. Specialists in animal remains have reconstructed menus and commerce. Amphorae are no longer merely shapes and insignias. Residue analysis can determine if a vessel contained oil from a specific grove or a fish sauce from a particular facility, and in some instances, can identify the contents after 2 millennia. The examination of tool impressions on walls and supports clarifies which restorations date to the urgent years after the earthquake of 60. And which belong to earlier phases. Surfaces now preserve not only mural compositions, but the brushwork textures of ancient artisans. The city has evolved into a laboratory where every skill is exhibited. Conservation has constituted the parallel science. Submerged city remains stable beneath the ash, but once uncovered, it demands care like any masonry town confronting sun, rain, and wind. Have been reconstructed over many chambers to shield exceptional paintings and stucco from water. Mortars compatible with ancient stone are employed for mending, rather than contemporary cements that retain dampness. Drains have been cleared beneath streets so that winter precipitation does not inundate the pavement. In the second decade of the 21st century, substantial initiative, with European backing, reinforced walls, mended long overlooked dwellings, enhanced drainage, facilitated new excavation in zones that completed the picture of entire districts. The project yielded new discoveries. Luraria with remarkably vibrant paintings materialized from residences in the northern sectors. A chamber painted in a deep red, featuring theatrical masks, got attention. A bakery exposed the harsh reality of slaves tethered to mills. On one thoroughfare, a wooden altar survived, as a carbonized outline impressed in the ash, leaving the silhouette of a panel structure, whose supports could be measured as if extant. Findings have revised specifics of the pivotal day. The charcoal date, inscribed on a wall undergoing mending and mentioned earlier, established at least one moment in mid-October. A coin discovered in a chamber sealed by the eruption bears an honorific of the Emperor Titus, minted only after early autumn. Chestnuts and pomegranates located in kitchens and storage areas are typical of an autumn larder. No individual artifact can demand absolute conviction, but collectively, they have persuaded many that the cataclysm occurred in the cooler weeks of the year. Braziers were already being lit in the evenings, and heavier cloaks were more accessible. Seasonal adjustment only intensifies the poignancy of casts, depicting people clustered in shawls and grasping at their faces as the pyroclastic flows engulfed them. Throughout the location, the casts persist in their instruction, the visage of a man oriented toward the earth, lifted in a gesture that might be supplication or defense. A woman protecting a child, a group that collapsed together outdoors where the ash formed dunes around grapevines. In one dwelling, the impression of a container shows where an individual attempted to retrieve a small collection of valuables and succumbed at the entryway. The dog on its tether communicates with a clarity no text can match. These are not merely exhibition pieces, they are distinct human artifacts that compel the living to preserve the city that contains them. The contemporary guide, who pauses in a garden, allowing a visitor to absorb this awareness, performs the same function as the ancient priest who clarified a ritual. Both are purveyors of memory. Pompeii exerts such a complete fascination. It is not solely the devastation, although the violent preservation has yielded a concentration of evidence unequaled in the Roman world. The fascination originates from the commonplace, rendered observable the graffiti on a column soliciting votes for a baker, the count marks incised by a merchant on a plaster wall, the hooks still positioned above a counter where lamps formerly hung, the indentations in an entryway worn by generations of sandals, the curse written in a back room, altar in an atrium where a family poured libations and sought protection. These are the artifacts that endure. They are the means by which a city continues to communicate after its inhabitants are gone. Pompeii is a site of destruction. It is also a text that can still be recited. More than 2/3 of the city has been uncovered. The remainder stays submerged beneath orchards and grasslands, a reminder that preservation can be a form of restraint. Archaeologists now excavate only when a specific query must be resolved or a conservation issue necessitates complete exposure. The decision respects an obligation to the future. The ash that extinguished life also protects. New technologies will someday extract more information from the soil than ours currently can. In the interim, the city exists in a peculiar secondary phase. It hosts millions of attendees, a quantity that would have been inconceivable to its ancient populace. It must sustain that burden without compromising the fragility of its wall paintings or the tranquility of its alleys. The sound of iron tires on stone can yet be envisioned. Ultimately, the narrative that commenced on a lava promontory above a river and a bay evolves into a narrative about the applications of memory. Pompeii enters the registry of locations that instruct through their persistence and their destruction. It informs us what a Roman city resembled behind its facades and beneath its pigments. It reveals the daily cadences of commerce, bathing, devotion, and labor. Reveals the scope of empire in a marketplace, where fish from the bay rested alongside fruit from inland groves. Wine intended for distant provinces awaited shipment in jars. It reveals a community that confronted sanction and seismic disaster, mended itself, maintained its resolve, and subsequently, it reveals the moment when all that persistence encountered a force that no human structure could withstand. The cataclysm preserved the documentation. Archaeology and meticulous stewardship have preserved the insight.